everyone. I think this is a fantastic presentation to follow because not only do I have some of the same pictures on my slides, there will be some of the themes that I think will be rather relevant for my take on this as well. So I'm going to be presenting my paper, The Hex Appeal, the Allure of Feminist Witchcraft. And well, what's not to love? We are currently in October, it's Halloween soon. You can get literally witch-themed everything everywhere. It is the season of the witch right now. I can start out by being quite honest about that. I love this. Like, I love these things, all of it. I'm very into it. I'm so happy whenever it's Halloween in October. That's going to be relevant because I am going to sound like I don't like these things sometimes, but that's from a strictly critical point of view, not because I actually dislike it. So I'm a historian by trade, and I'm going to come back to that. And what have inspired this paper and this talk I want to give here today is that I see witchy things everywhere. I see Witchrature, I see Witchtok, I see like it in games, on all my Facebook ads, on social media. It's literally everywhere. I have a lot of playlists I love on Spotify that's called Witchy Workouts or something like that. They're great. There's lots of Witchrature. These are all Danish book examples, but there's plenty of English ones as well. Well, Margaret Meyer is technically English, but that's been translated to Danish. And I've been quite intrigued by this because I've noticed that a lot of my historian colleagues are not too happy to engage with this, or at least the colleagues working with the history of witchcraft. So I have a PhD in history. It's written about the late witchcraft trials, so very much about how you stopped persecuting witchcraft as a crime in Denmark, and also drawing parallels to other places in Europe. I've worked as a museum curator for several years. I've been part of establishing a permanent museum called Hex Museum of Witch Hunt in Ribe. It's about witch hunts. And I have just started working north of Copenhagen in a municipality called Rudersdal, because one of the judges from my thesis owned the oldest manor house there. Very important, cool guy who was skeptic about the whole burning witches. Working with the museum, doing a PhD in history, I am also going to be honest about that. My methodology or my theory are building on like historic research traditions. I've been working a lot with narratives, with identity, but I also really want to open up a critical talk, drawing a little bit or building on some of the points from Egel's talk yesterday. I want to invite a critical talk about witches and the feminist witch identity, like this thing that I call the hex appeal. This fantasy of primordial power for women that exists independently of male dominance. And I'm going to argue that that this narrative has both positive and negative potential pitfalls. So this paper serves a little bit like a work in progress for me and future research, and interest in combining a more cross-disciplinary approach to combining the fields of history, sociology, religious, and esoteric studies. Now, let's get to it. I want to try and see if I can conjure forth the ghost of witches, past, present, and future in this. So, let us begin with looking at the word witch, or the term witch. Which witch is which? Like, what are we dealing with? I have shamelessly stolen that sentence from somewhere else. Somebody wrote it once, and I thought it was great. I love saying it. Because from my point of view as a historian, 1600 witch in early modern time, a witch is evil. Witchcraft is powers derived from Satan. They're malevolent. They are there to harm good people. It is not to be confused with magic. Magic is not inherently evil. Magic can be evil, whereas witchcraft and witches are inherently evil in an early modern context. Now, if we look at today, 2024, a witch can be many, many things, and it's quite complex, because all of these witches are related. They have root in the same history, but they are not the same witch, is what I'm arguing here. So you can have historical, fairy tale, fantasy, witchrature, spiritual, identity, a curse word, political. You can probably have a vast array of other kinds of witches. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Like, that's a very famous quote. Originally, it was thou shalt not suffer a poisoner to live, if we look at it. The word witch was introduced in the translation from 1611 in King James I's Bible. And as you can see here, if we look at the word used in Hebrew, I do not speak Hebrew, so I'm not going to try and say it, or pharmakeia, which is also not really a witch, it's more like pharmacy, it's something with herbs, maleficus, evil. We also call witchcraft maleficium in Latin, and then finally it becomes like a poisoner in English. This word is not necessarily a witch to begin with, and it's definitely not a sorcerer, but it's a complex term where it is, thou shalt not suffer somebody who practices malevolent powers in secret with their agenda to hurt other people to live. It is not a thou shalt not suffer somebody with magical abilities to live. So there's that little thing there. I'm not going to turn this into a pure lecture on history, but I do want to talk a little bit about trying to understand some of the myth around witches. So if we look at these are 10 of the myths about historical witch hunts that we ended up putting on our website for the museum Hex, because these were the questions we were often asked, or where people assumed that this was historical fact. So the witch hunt took place in the Dark Age or the Middle Ages. They did not. They took place in the Renaissance or early modern times. Only women were convicted as witches. Again, no, men were convicted as well. I'll return to that. People used accusation of witchcraft as revenge. I cannot rule out that that happens sometimes, but as an overall theme, that is not what we see in the source material. All convicted witches were burned at the stake. Nope, several places they were either hung or beheaded. And there's also different ways in which you can be burned. Not everyone was burned at the stake. Let's see. It was the church that conducted the witch hunts, also not true. In a lot of places, it was not the clerical courts, but the secular courts who conducted witch hunts. It was very much not priests or the Inquisition that drove them. Again, also in some areas, but it's a vastly complex field. Torture was used at will. Nope, they were aware that torture would probably produce false testimonies, but in some places, witchcraft was considered crimen exceptum, so a really dangerous crime, in which case you can torture. Think Guantanamo. We know that it's not good to do, but sometimes people do the bad thing anyway if they're scared. But overall, it was not illegal to apply at will. Witches were largely only persecuted in Catholic countries. That's especially a thing for Protestant countries. We grew up believing that the Catholics were somehow more evil. No. Let's see, once accused as a witch, one's fate was sealed. Nope, there's a almost 50% chance if we look at the statistics for being found not guilty in a witch trial. The water ordeal, like where you're being like swimming a witch, you've seen it in Monty Python, was used to prove that someone was a witch, and the suspect drowned regardless of the outcome. So either you drowned or you got burned. Also not true. It's a long tradition, but if you did sink, there was a rope tied to you and you were being pulled up again. I do have examples of that going badly in England a few times where people did drown, and people who had conducted the swimming were then persecuted for murder. You were not allowed to be a vigilant in this society. And then the last one is probably what we're going to spend most time on. It was the herbalists, wise, cunning women who were burned as witches. Very, very, very rarely, but it's a very strong narrative, and that's what we're going to get into. So, to understand early modern witch hunt, you need to understand that the fear of the witch was real. The witch, or the constructed diabolical conspirator working in cahoots with Satan, to just wanting to eat babies and hurt everyone, that witch was not real, but the fear of it was. So even if there's this conspiracy of evilness didn't actually happen, you can think of it as the fear being closer to that of the fear of QAnon or a secret lizard government. That's probably not true, but people can still be actually scared of it. And that's for me always interesting, to always assume that people, even if they lived 100, 500, or 1,000 years ago, were not more dumb than me. They were not more stupid. They were still caring. They wanted the best for everyone around them. They wanted to build a nice, safe, secure society. But being afraid of having security ripped away from you can make you do really stupid things. So if you want to understand the fear, I highly recommend watching The Witch from 2015, because it takes the fear serious. It treats the fear as being real, like whatever it is, like these stories of the Sabbath, of the diabolical conspiracy. And I think it does that really, really well. And there's the gender aspect. So witch hunts and trials were misogynist, because society was. But you did not get accused of witchcraft because you were a woman, but you were more likely to get accused due to being a woman. So in a society where having a male head of the household was vital, if you were on the outskirts of society, a minority, if you were an older, poor, single woman without a husband or a son to provide from you, and you were weird, you were walking around, you were mumbling to yourself, you were begging for scraps of food, you would more easily gain a reputation for witchcraft, so for being an omen of bad luck. And having nobody to defend you, well, there's absolutely that gender bias of ending up being more easily suspected of witchcraft. But it was not a systematic hunt for women. It was a systematic hunt for witches. When we look at this, the numbers for Europe, we know that around 100,000 people were persecuted as witches between 1450 and 1750. Approximately 16,000 of these were executed for witchcraft. It's not the 6 to 9 millions that are quite often being thrown around, but 60,000 people are plenty of people. It's enough people. Like, we don't need to up it up to 9 million. Out of these, 75 to 80% were women. So there's, again, absolutely a gender aspect here that's important. But that still leaves that every fourth-ish was a man. And in some areas, like, men were more readily accused of witchcraft than women during this period. Again, another topic. So witchcraft was not a gendered crime, but a crime often ascribed gender bias. So can say a bit like murder. Like, people committing murder are often men. That's a fact. We know that from statistic. It doesn't mean that they have the sole right to being murderers. Women can murder too. It does. Yeah, you liked that, didn't you? Yeah. So it does introduce an idea of also a difference between class and gender during early modern times, where the wise wizard type was often not at all put in cahoots with witches. So you see it in Shakespeare's The Tempest, where, again, wise sort of a Gandalf or Dumbledore kind of wizard type. That's also, I think the best archetype of this today is Doctor Strange. Like, he's producing a lot of like ritual magic, a lot of high-end magic. That's not really the thing that people were afraid of. Whereas the chaotic, malevolent powers from Satan, like the three witches here in Macbeth, double, toil and trouble, that's the thing they're afraid of, and also shown a little bit with how they've chosen to portray Wanda and Maximoff. And again, this chaotic, potentially very harmful and destructive magic that will end up causing the end of society. So I mentioned that I work a lot about the idea of identity. And it's a thing both that I've tried to look into what did people think of themselves, like what can we see, how they talk about themselves, how society views them, but also it's a thing I want to pose a question for you in this, where when we work with history, does modern identity make you an expert on a field of research? So I am inclined to argue that no. If you are a modern witch, that does not necessarily make you an authority or expert on the history of witches or witchcraft. It makes you an expert on your lived reality, on your experience here and now, but not a universal oracle for the past experiences of others. In history of emotions and experience, when we look at that, generally there's a consensus that emotions and experiences are not universal. So even if we are experiencing grief today or incarceration today, that does not necessarily put us into the shoes of somebody experiencing those things 200 or 300 years ago, because it's a vastly different society they lived in, the fears were different, the expectations were different. I heard one argue at some point about PTSD, for example. If you are in a society where it has not been introduced as a concept, soldiers might not experience shame or PTSD if it's not a thing that's ever been introduced that they can. Again, vast field that I'm just quickly gonna sort of like glide over here. Lots of just fun pictures of witches because they're nice, and it's always interesting to see that what can now be interpreted as like quite fun parties were terrifying for people back in the day when we look at it here, because there are people, like they're eating a baby over there where it says D in the bottom here, or the children here, child witches taking care of toads so they can be used for curses. And that then turns into this more liberal, like freedom almost, experience of being a witch, of flying. That doesn't really translate into the fear of the flying witch that'll prey upon you from above. Witches are also quite often then put in opposition to cunning folk. And quite often when I'm again transparent, I do not consider myself a modern witch or a practitioner, but when I meet a lot of modern practitioners that identify as witches, what I often feel as a historian is that they are not drawing on the tradition of witchcraft, they're drawing on the tradition of magic. And I distinguish between those two. So a lot of the practice for me comes more closely to that of cunning folk throughout the ages. So this idea that in 1600, everyone practiced magic. Like everyone did a little bit of magic at home. The priest did a lot of magic. We have several priests getting burned for witchcraft, by the way, throughout the period. But everyone practiced magic. Magic in itself was not feared. Again, being harmed, being cursed, somehow having your livelihood and your health taken away from you was feared. So, yeah, here's just a few examples of this idea that there is. I highly recommend watching the first season of Sabrina, the new chilling adventures of Sabrina, because it highlights perfectly the difference between the diabolical witchcraft and cunning. You have both represented there, and they do a whole other story arc as the seasons progress. But if you watch the first season, it's great because again it shows the diabolical witchcraft and comes close to actually representing what kind of witches they were afraid of doing the witch hunts. So the mythical witch and the wise herbal woman. Several people have talked about Blavatsky on this conference, and the whole idea of rejected knowledge. And when she published Isis Unveiled in 1877, other people were also doing this. I've just chosen a few examples. She was also arguing for this idea of the ancient cult of a wise herbal woman that the church had been very afraid of. That was actually the explanation for the early modern witch hunts. It's a very good narrative. So obviously other people took it up, one of them being Matilda Jocelyn Gage in 1893. And she's actually the first one who uses the 9 million women were burned because the church were afraid of them. That's a number that's been replicated and repeated numerous times since then, and Dan Brown, by the way. But also, it's even though it's been slightly scaled down by Silvia Federici in Caliban and the Witch from 2005, she's also saying 6 million women, which is statistically just not true. I have other ways in which I disagree with some of her points, but again, let's take that over a beer. Margaret Murray also then published The Witch Cult in Western Europe in 1929, and again, encompasses this idea of not a secret conspiracy of diabolical witches, but a secret conspiracy of paganist wise women who had secret knowledge, who had secret herbal abilities, who did healing, and those were the women that were being persecuted. It's something that Heinrich Himmler was a huge fan of. He was really into the occult and witchcraft, and he had a witch overview, Der Hexenkartothek. He believed that his great-great-great-great-grandmother, Margaret Himmler, had been executed as a witch. And the idea of this secret society of witches spoke right into fascism, and also produced the myth of witches with red hair. That's speaking on something like pure race. That's how you could tell that they were true witches, that they were Gaelic, that they were Nordic. So whenever you hear somebody say that about red hair, just know that it's a myth stemming from the 1930s fascism. I'm fun at parties, can you tell? So this quest for authenticity in antiquity is not new. It's something we do with all of the founding myths, whether it be Rome or it be like with Vikings or like Christianity. We generally like to be able to draw our lines way back into the past to sort of gain some authenticity in what we do. So it's not strange that this is happening with witchcraft in modern time or witches. It's a merging of memories and concepts. Like it's merging Lilith or Hecate or Circe or Medea with ideas of Freya or Völva, Nordic practitioners of magic, and generally putting all of them into the big cauldron together. I've tried to sort of like put it together in some of the archetypes you get of witches. So there's horror archetype number 1. It's the old hag, dried up, old and ugly, envious on fertility. And there's the horror archetype number 2, Satan's mistress, lustful and twisted, steals manhood, sexual relations with the devil. Then there's horror archetype number 3. Again, that could be anyone. Anyone could be a witch, like the secret conspiracy that you never know who to look out for. So classic witches, they worship Satan, wants to hurt ordinary people, they eat children, like eat babies. Whereas modern witches, this feminist myth of the witch or identity of the witch, worships nature, is demonized for sexuality or for being outspoken, but not necessarily anything in regards to Satan. So, to sum it up, some of the dark side or pitfalls of this hex appeal is that this memory war, where you have a more appealing narrative, you might exclude and eradicate a whole group of people. So when you told the whole "we are the granddaughters of the witches you could not burn," it's kind of saying again, this is the history of the strong women, the outspoken women, not the minority, not the old ugly women, not the weird ones, the ones that are not very nice, but where I think that those women also deserve feminist empowering. So I come across a lot of these. They're fun. So fact, historically pockets and dresses were phased out to prevent women from concealing spells and charms. No, I have no idea who came up with this, but I've seen it circulated online so many times. Women were allowed pockets. That's pockets over there. They were literally hung around their skirt. There is something in the idea that the concealed secret magic was generally frowned upon, but it got nothing to do with pockets. Our weird fashion choices today and the reason why we can't get pockets does not have anything to do with the witch hunts. And again, even though these things are like, they're fun, but they risk excluding this one. Like these weren't very likely suspects of witchcraft. She was. There's a reason why the old pancake witch lives in the forest. So I think that we come closer to finding a parallel to early modern witches here than we do with some modern practitioners. And that is not me saying that they are not real witches. They are, but they are not necessarily the same kind of witches that people were persecuting. That's the distinction I'm trying to argue here. Yeah, and that's also a pitfall. I was at this last year. It was the Feministic Midsummer Celebration. A political party were trying to move this along, but they were doing it on the basis of incorrect history, where they were saying, so witch hunts took place and men were persecuting women, so therefore we should have this celebration. And I'm all for a feministic midsummer. I think that would be rad. but I would rather it didn't happen on the basis of eradicating other people. So witch hunts are still happening around the world. We have Samuel here in Nigeria. He's been. This is a scar from a machete to his head. This is Margaret in Papua New Guinea, and this is Maria in Norway. She's Sami. So also to remember sometimes that even though we can have fun with witchcraft and magic, some places you still die if people think that you're a witch. The light side, let's end on a nice note, shall we? I'll quickly go over this. Remember how I said that I love all of these things? Like I really do. So, Danish writer Karen Blixen, when she came back to Denmark in the 1930s, she's quoted for having said she now had the option of becoming a grandmother, a prioress, or a witch. Like there is power in the role of the witch. It rejects societal norms and expectations. Like there is a reclaiming of the idea of the witch. It's a lot of what Brennan was talking about in her presentation. And there's absolutely very, very positive and good sides of that. Like when we look at, this is one of my favorites, the journey of Elphaba, or the Wicked Witch of the West, from L. Frank Baum's portrayal of her in the original novel, into Margaret Hamilton in the movie, into Gregory Maguire's very queer reinterpretation, into Broadway musical, Idina Menzel. And like, that's the same character over almost 100 years, and I think it highlights very well how we have reinterpreted. We are no longer happy with just a black and white evil for the sake of being evil. We are more happy to sort of ascribe more nuance to the role of monsters or to fear, to try and deconstruct the fear itself and see what are we afraid of in these things. So not always just being afraid of the ugly old hag, but maybe embracing the inner crone more. Yeah. Then there's obviously like magical activism. It's great. So that's absolutely happening. And let's see here, like Witch, for example. If you join that, you must stand for anti-racism, anti-fascism, anti-patriarchy, indigenous rights, gender self-determination, women's liberation, trans liberation, anti-rape, culture, reproductive rights, sex worker support, LGBTQIA rights, environmental protection, religious freedom, immigrant rights, anti-war, anti-capitalism, disability justice, privacy rights, and workers' rights. I mean, what's not to like about that? I mean, that's pretty great. It does something great for like when you re-enchant the world, you treat nature with more kindness, which is good. I love that. It does provide more like society or like accessibility for people to join communities, give them a feeling of power, this feeling that everyone can be witches. We can all be witches. And just to say, I'm very much a product of this myself. I published a book that was like for teenagers on the history of magic, and my publishing house insisted it was called witchery. Oh, like I was trying to be like, no, and they were like, yes, because it sells. And it's one of those things, I'm spending a lot of time in the book distinguishing between witchcraft, magic, and something that doesn't translate easily, trolldom, which is Danish sorcery, thank you. So also just to be very, very transparent, and even though I'm critical and I want us to have a critical debate about this witch, I too am in it. And in a few weeks, there's a conference at the National Museum here that's called Heksetid, the Witching Time, where I know at least Casper, probably several other, myself, are going to be talking about some of these concepts. So it's there. Right. Finishing, we might not be the granddaughters of the witches they could not burn, but we can be the grandparents of those that will not burn witches.